Howard Vlieger is a third-generation family farmer from Sioux County, Iowa. He also works and teaches as an independent crop nutrition advisor and has international acclaim for his work with all systems of agriculture and land reclamation. Howard helps farmers maximize their crops and optimize their soil biology. He also works with the remediation of glyphosate contaminated land, water, livestock, and humans. Howard works with scientists and researchers around the world to develop effective solutions to problems farmers are experiencing because of GMO crops and glyphosate. He is the co-author and the primary coordinator of a first-of-its-kind scientific study, the feeding of GMO grain and non-GMO grain to pigs for their lifetime as a meat animal.
Thank you, Cheryl, and thanks for this opportunity to be here. I humbly identify myself as a student of the soil. In 1989, because of the turn of events of what was going on our family farm, I was desperate. And I looked into and began using what was known at that time as alternative crop production. Today we refer to it as biological farming. And as a student of the soil, I have no problem admitting the more I know I don't know. And I feel that is maybe the case with many, many things that we set out to learn about. Because of the success that we had with the biological farming on our farm, in 1992 I started offering and sharing this information with other family farmers that were interested. And that's been an amazing privilege and an amazing journey. The ability of what we've been able to learn through all of the on-farm research in both crop and livestock production all across the United States and in Canada, where I've been blessed to work with farmers, has been phenomenal. In 1994, I was in the crop production sales arena as well as the advisory arena, and we were being told about genetically engineered crops, and I thought it's my responsibility on behalf of the customers to learn about this. So I started studying them. I was directly connected with the seed company, doing test plots since 1984 for the different varieties. And then in 1997, we did our first on-farm research with BT corn. And we took and I'm not going to expect you to read all the numbers on this slide because they're small, but I'll point out the key ones to you. We took our old reliable favorite corn hybrid, which was very sound agronomically, and we put it in the test plot. Right next to it, we put the BT version of that same hybrid. And the cost of the seed for old reliable was $26.18 an acre, and the cost of the seed for the BT GMO version was $38 an acre. When we harvested the grain, the yield for old reliable was 149.91 bushels per acre, and the BT was 146 bushels per acre. And it was 5 percentage points wetter. And of course, the farmers in the room know you get docked for moisture when you deliver grain. So when we took that and we figured everything in the bottom line, we lost $57.99 an acre with that GMO hybrid. We repeated that same experiment in the other half of that field the following year. We lost $58.95 an acre. And the seed company saw that same result in a vast majority of the plots where they had this hybrid in the BT version. But there were other hybrids that didn't have the good all-around sound agronomic characteristics that the old reliable did. And they would see, when we had the years of the insect pressure, they would see a yield response by having the BT in that maybe second-class hybrid, some of our customers would say, or some of the guys were a little more blunt. They'd say, well, the plant breeders just stopped short of finishing their job. They didn't develop a good hybrid. And when that was the case, then the BT would perform, and of course, they were getting more for the seed, so it was somewhat easy to figure out which one they were going to promote. As Cheryl said, I have been extremely privileged to work with scientists and researchers from all around the world. This is just, and the other day I noticed I should update this, but I could probably fill 3 slides with all of the names of scientists and researchers that I'm privileged to work with. One of these is no longer with us, but some of his research I'll share with you. What's the motivation? You know, people ask, why is there the big push for this? We're told that we have to grow more food to feed the growing population in the world. And, well, that's never been proven. Genetic engineering in any independent research plot has never been documented and verified to increase yield. But being in the seed business starting in 1984 and quitting in 2010, I saw the change in the seed prices. And there was something connected to the genetically engineered crop known as technology fees. This is the royalty that was charged on every bag of seed that the farmer has to pay to the seed company who holds the patent on the genetically engineered seed. So in 2010, when I decided to discontinue in the seed sales arena, I sat down and I did the math on what does this amount to if we presume that all of the acres of corn, soybeans, cotton, canola, and sugar beets in the United States were genetically engineered. Again, presuming 100% utilization and using USDA's numbers for the acres planted. That year we had 87.9 million acres of corn. The tech fee was $60 per acre. That was not the seed. That was just a technology fee or the royalty that was collected on that seed if you were planting the latest and greatest genetically engineered hybrid. That would calculate to $5.274 billion for corn. On soybeans, we had 78.9 million acres. The tech fee was only $24 an acre. That generates just under $1.9 billion tech fee. Cotton, $78 an acre, only 10.9 million acres in the U.S. that year, so $850 million and change. Had the privilege of working with cotton producers in the southeast U.S. for 3 years. 1993, a 50-pound bag of cotton seed cost $45 to $60 per bag. In 2010, they no longer sold a 50-pound bag. The bag would weigh from 36 to 48 pounds, depending on the size of the seed. And the cost breakdown was like this. The seed cost is $159.99. The technology fee is $412.20 per bag. The seed treatment, which is a combination insecticide, fungicide, and nematicide that they have to put on the seed. If they don't, they will not get a viable stand of cotton in a cotton field. With the farming techniques, so much of the beneficial microorganisms in the soil have been destroyed, and they have to use these toxins in order to establish a stand of cotton. So we have a total in 2010 of $697.19 and change for a bag of cottonseed versus $60 in 1993. Continuing on, sugar beets again in 2010, presuming 100% planted acres in the U.S. would generate 96 million. We don't raise that much canola in the U.S., that's only 9 million. So subtotaling all these crops, not including the Roundup Ready alfalfa, is just under $8.7 billion. Well, last year I was asked to speak in Eastern Canada, and I thought, well, I don't want to leave our good friends in Canada out of this equation. So I figured the 2010 planting of canola in Canada and the acres and the tech fee, and that generated $1.2 billion and change. So the rough estimate for the technology fees that would be generated with all these crops in one planting, this isn't seed, this isn't fertilizer, this isn't chemical, is $9.9 billion. What's their motivation? We've been told, and sadly by some of the people at our land-grant universities who know better, that genetic modification has been occurring for thousands of years, and this is no different. It's just an accelerated process. This is absolutely, completely, totally, and blatantly untrue. Genetic engineering is occurring in the lab. This will not occur in nature. Unlike species do not cross. They do not insert DNA from unlike species into the genome of the plant in nature. It only happens in the lab. A foreign gene is shot or inserted into the DNA of the plant. There is no control where the placement of that will end up in that plant. And there's no control on how it may affect this, the DNA of that plant, and the role and the function in that plant. They may use a virus, such as the cauliflower mosaic virus, as a promoter to initiate the event that they want to occur within the plant. They may use a genetically engineered antibiotic-resistant bacteria. They'll purposely develop a bacteria that's resistant to antibiotics as a marker for knowing where the placement is. An agrobacterium may be used, or sometimes referred to as a cancer cell of the soil, to get full infection of the mechanism or the characteristic that they want within the plant. They have also used components of E. coli as infection mechanisms to get this result in this plant. It is not a natural process. In fact, European Food Safety Authority analyzed 85 different genetically engineered crops, and they found 54 of them contained unidentified and unspecified foreign either organisms or compounds, and they're supposed to identify what is present in this. I received this slide from a retired molecular microbiologist at Washington State University. I was in Washington State and Seattle of 2013 giving this type of presentation, and I made the comment they had a 1 in 100,000 chance of putting the foreign protein or the insertion into the DNA in that plant. They had a 1 in 100,000 chance of getting it in the same spot twice. And Dr. Sudoku raised her hand and she said, "Howard, it's not nearly that accurate. I used to do this in the lab." And then she sent me this slide along with the numbers. It's 1 in a trillion to 1 in 100 trillion chance that they can put it in the same spot twice. And you may wonder, well, you know, what difference does that make, or does that matter? I'm going to show you why that's important pretty quick. Every time a genetic alteration is made with the processes that they have used at this point in time, there is a potential for a development of a foreign protein in the fruit of that plant. This foreign protein can either have a subtle or a dramatic change to the mammal that consumes it, many times causing moderate and or severe inflammation. The immune system challenges. 70 to 80% of the cells in our immune system are located in our digestive tract. Now, I want you to imagine for a minute that I am your immune system. I'm in your stomach. It's my job to protect you 24/7, 365. You have just eaten something that contains a foreign protein that I identify it when it comes into the domain that I'm to protect. So let's pretend that this is a foreign protein you've just consumed, and I'm going to do my job. I'm going to try and get rid of it 24/7, 365. Now I want you to imagine you're going to leave here now, and you're going to come back here 24 hours from now. What will happen to my strength? Is it going to get stronger or weaker? With ingredients from genetically engineered crops and 70 to 80% of the processed food, could there be a reason why we are seeing epidemic increases in a variety of autoimmune diseases? As I said, I've had the benefit of working with family farmers in crop and livestock production all across the U.S. since 1992. In 1998, we received a phone call from a farmer in Nebraska, farrow to finish hog operation. Planted his first BT corn. He put it in a separate bin. He made a batch of feed for the sows as he was going to turned the boars in with him for conception. After the conception, he did the pregnancy test, and his conception rate dropped 30%. He called us and he says, "What's going on?" And they had the vet out, they did blood work, they tried this, they tried that, and I said, "We have heard stories from different customers that when they're feeding BT, things don't work like they're supposed to on conception rates." I said, "Don't use that corn." Well, he mistakenly went back to it one more time. The second time he did it, he saw a 70% reduction in his conception rate. A different BT corn, a different year, with an operator in South Dakota that had extremely explicit records. When they fed BT corn to their sows, they saw 1.6 pigs less per litter, and the weight of the pigs was less when they were born. In Southwest Iowa, 2-3 years later, a different BT corn. And so you know, this didn't all happen just boom, every time, every place, every single instance. But this frequency of these problems kept intensifying and building and building and intensifying. But in Southwest Iowa in 2002, this one gentleman had something called pseudopregnancies. His sows appeared to be bred. They would go full gestation, and upon delivery, all they would have was a sack of water and the afterbirth. There were no piglets. It was known as pseudopregnancies. He worked with his vet. He worked with the university. They checked it. They couldn't figure out the problem. There was no mold in the corn. There was no disease in the sows. Well, he was a member of the Farm Bureau. So the reporter from the Farm Bureau spokesman came out to his place and wrote up the story about the problems he was having. The week after that story aired in the Farm Bureau spokesman, he starts getting phone calls from farmers in the surrounding areas. They were all having the same problem. They were all working with their vets. They couldn't find the answer. The farmers got together and started talking, and they all realized they're all feeding the exact same BT corn. They discontinued the use of that corn and the problem went away, but the university was not able to possibly connect that BT corn to the problem. In our part of Iowa, when we saw genetically engineered feedstuffs in the ration, we saw an increased incidence of ileitis, salmonella, bloody bowel, and ulcers. If the animals succumb to these digestive diseases over time, ulcers were very prevalent upon postmortem of these animals. So we were seeing this from 1998 up until 2008. I had the opportunity to take a tour of a hog slaughter plant. And I'm going to show you some pictures of hog stomachs. They're a little graphic, but I've never had anybody faint or pass out. And if you do, I do know CPR. Dr. McGuire was a veterinary at the plant that showed me everything that I'm going to share with you, or part of what it was. And Dr. Newman was a veterinary I had the good fortune of working for 10 years when I got out of high school. I worked for him part-time while I was farming. He was the only veterinary that I showed these pictures to that really knew what a healthy hog stomach looked like. From 98 to 2008, we saw this increased irritation and inflammation in the stomachs, and the vets that were practicing in that time period who were younger, if you start to see something all the time, what do you start to call it after a while? Well, it wasn't. This is what a drug-free, non-GM fed pig stomach should look like. You can see the overall skin tone color. This yellow is normal. That's mucus. It's there as a result of there being no feed in the stomach for the animal to digest, so that's normal. You'll see it in varying degrees in the different pictures. But look at the skin tone color of that healthy stomach. This is also an animal that was fed without antibiotics for life, but presumably fed GM. Notice the overall irritation and inflammation. And I say presumably fed because in 2008, when I took these pictures, we had 75 to 85% GM corn in the feed supply and 85 to 90% GM soy in the feed supply, so it was a safe presumption that that's what they were eating. Another one, the overall irritation, inflammation. You can see some pinpoint ulcers here, 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 There was a full-blown bleeding ulcer there. This is a pig that was fed antibiotics for its lifetime, right up until the withdrawal period. Notice how the overall color of that stomach is pale. Well, Dr. McGuire was quick to point out to me the benefit of the antibiotic in reducing that inflammation. But right dead center is an ulcer. This is the worst antibiotic-fed pig stomach that I took a picture of. And as you can see, it's pale, but there's evidence of a number of severe ulcers. So as a result of accumulating this information, I was working with Dr. Elaine Ingham at that time on the soils program on our farm, and I shared this with her, and I said, this is just circumstantial and coincidental. She said, no, Howard, the correct term for this scientifically is anecdotal. You have gathered and accumulated the evidence, now set up the protocols and do the scientific study to see if you can verify and document what you've been witnessing. So I was fortunate to meet Dr. Judy Carmen from Australia over the phone and by email, and we set up the protocol to do the study. We took 84 pigs right off of their mother and put them, they were evenly separated for sex and size, random replication or separation. 84 pigs on a non-GM diet and 84 pigs on a GM diet from the day they were weaned off of mama till the day they went to harvest for a meat animal. When we harvested the animals, we had 2 licensed practicing veterinarians that did complete autopsies and looked at every organ part of the animal. We weighed all the organs that was appropriate. We collected all of that data. Again, a healthy pig stomach. Being the anecdotal information was stomach problems, so that was something we looked at very closely. And this was what you would call a stomach with severe inflammation. The statistical findings in the study were this. There were 2 significant findings. The GM-fed pigs had a 260% increased likelihood of having severe inflammation in their stomachs. The males had a 400% increase in the likelihood of this inflammation, and the females a 220% increase in the likelihood. And that made me wonder for a long time, why were the males more susceptible than the females? Well, I got that question answered at the scientific symposium I was invited to attend and speak at in Beijing, China in July of this past year. It's because of the testosterone production by the male that they're more susceptible to what's going on. We see the same thing in boys with autism. The rate of autism is much higher in boys than it is in girls, and it's too high in both. 260% increase in severe stomach inflammation overall, and the females, there was a 25% increase in the utera weight of the GM-fed females. They were 25% abnormally heavy. We didn't know this until 3 days after the autopsies were done, when all this information was calculated and put into the scientific graph. And if we'd have known it, we'd have certainly preserved all of those organs in complete entirety. And of course, the budget didn't allow some of that. But severe stomach inflammation and increased utera or abnormal utera weight and size. Well, you remember we had reproductive problems, we had digestive problems. Did we find 2 body parts that showed us there could be a reason for concern there? To me, the most revealing thing that we learned is this, and it has to be classified as anecdotal because we didn't anticipate it, so we didn't have our protocol established in this manner to document it. Dr. Arpad Pustai, who's recognized in the scientific community as the leader in foreign proteins in the study of lectins and the potential damage to the immune system, gave us input on the protocol for our study. I remember when he told me, you have to weigh these pigs every week. And I said, every week? And he said, if you don't, you won't know if they quit growing at a certain stage. And I argued with him. I said, of course I can see that. But I'm glad he made us do this, because the thing that we saw, we ran these pigs through a simple maze every day. When they were little, we just picked them up and put them on the scale. When they got bigger, they went through this simple maze. The people that were weighing the pigs didn't know who was fed what, but all the pigs were in the same pen every time. And the pigs from this pen and this pen would go through this simple maze much quicker and with less hassle than the pigs in this pen and this pen. The pigs in this pen and this pen were confused. They couldn't perform this simple task. As soon as you got them in confined quarters, they were irritable. They were fighting and biting and picking on one another, and it took longer. When they were back in their normal pen, there was an overall listlessness in this pen and this pen, and they never, this pen and this pen, they'd eat, they'd drink, they'd lay down, and life was good. This pen and this pen, always picking on one another. I look at that, and remember, this is 1998 to 2008 when we take this 10-year time period. And when the study is conducted, when a scientific study is completed, you may look at 2 to 8 years to the day it's published from the day you know the results. So let's go back to 1998, the start of the problem, and let's go fast forward to 2013 when this study was published. That's 15 years. I know of scientific studies that have been conducted now as a follow-up to what we learned in this study, focusing on looking at behavioral changes in mammals that are consuming GM. Has there been a change in the behavior of the children and the young adults in your country like there has been in ours? They call the children in our country Generation RX because they're on some type of medication to control their mood and their behavior. Do we have 15 years to wait? This is as unscientific as you can have it. But the mothers of babies and young children that I am privileged and fortunate to communicate with in all parts of North America and even around the world, they all tell me the same thing. When they take their kids off of GM, their behavior changes. This is a picture of the infamous amaranth pigweed. Believe it or not, that's a cornfield. The amaranth pigweed is known as a superweed. It will get 10 to 12 feet tall. The base of the plant is so big I can't even begin to put my hand around it. If you cut it off, it'll laugh at you. It'll be grown up before you get back out of the field. You got to dig it out. There's no combination of chemical that will kill it. It used to be this tall when it was full grown, about 3 foot. They have 100,000 seeds. Now there's estimates of over 500,000 seeds per plant. It has developed resistance to glyphosate herbicide. Glyphosate, as Cheryl mentioned, is the most widely used herbicide in the world. The reason it was so effective as a herbicide is because of the fact it's systemic. You put one drop on that plant, it's going to translocate everywhere. A minimum of 20% of it's going into the soil. When it gets into the soil, it's an active antibiotic, killing beneficial microorganisms in the soil. This was denied for a long time, but I'll show you evidence of the fact that this is for real. It's also a very strong chelator. Chelate is a Greek word meaning claw or to hold. When you chelate something, you bind it up and make it unavailable. Glyphosate will chelate calcium, magnesium, manganese, zinc, iron, copper, nickel, cobalt, boron, selenium, molybdenum, and potassium. And it won't let go, depending on the conditions, pH, and other related factors of that mineral. So it's tying up that nutrition. It ties it up in the soil, it ties it up in the plant. If the nutrient is in the grain or the foodstuff, if glyphosate is present, it's also going to tie up that nutrient in that food supply. Glyphosate will not kill a plant if it's raised in sterile soil. This is a scientific study that's been replicated several times. This is an edible bean plant, a bean like you would grow in your garden that you would eat. This is sterile soil. They put that soil in an autoclave and they kill everything. There's no bacteria, there's no fungi. That is dead soil. This is that same bean plant growing in field soil. All of the bacteria and the fungi and the microorganisms are present in that soil. And this is the control. That's the one that didn't get sprayed. Spray this with glyphosate in sterile soil. There's no opportunistic organisms there. There's no mechanism to kill the weed. In essence, that weed just kind of hunkers down for 10 days to 2 weeks. After that 2-week time period, it started growing again. It will not die. You have to have disease present in order to kill a weed with glyphosate. When you put glyphosate on anything, weed, genetically engineered crop, or whatever else, you are going to predispose that plant to disease. There's proof of that here. These are corn stalks that are split in half. And they purposely infected these corn stalks with anthrax, which causes stalk rot. They injected it right here. This plant was not sprayed with glyphosate. After they injected it, you can see how that plant kind of walled off that disease and stopped it from spreading. On these, after they injected them with glyphosate, or excuse me, with the anthrax, they sprayed it with glyphosate. That completely wiped out that plant's ability to defend itself against disease. Whenever you spray any plant with glyphosate, you predispose that plant to disease. Because regardless of the fact that it's genetically engineered and won't die when you spray it, it still ties up all of these micronutrients. It ties up the amino acids and the enzymes that help the plant defend itself against the disease, and it stops the growth hormones from moving within that plant. So it just kind of sits there. You might, and plants don't have an immune system, they have a defense system. But if it had an immune system, you could say you're giving that plant a bad case of AIDS. Well, when these weeds build up this resistance, they're not resistant to the glyphosate. They're resistant to the disease that actually kills them. That's why we see this development of superweeds. Killing the beneficial microorganisms in the soil. The pseudomonads, the manganese reducers, which are the IPPs, and the indoleacetic acid producers, these are all beneficial organisms. The control is no glyphosate. You spray the glyphosate on, you see the counts of those beneficial organisms go down. Here's fusarium, the opportunistic or bad, the one that causes the pythium, the phytophthora, the scleria, sclerotia, sclerotinia, all the different plant diseases in crop production. The glyphosate feeds that organism. The one that controls it dissipates, and the bad one increases. So what's the end result? Scientific comparison of non-GMO soybean and glyphosate-resistant soybean. In the lab, side by side, they sprayed glyphosate. The lignin, or the woody component of the plant, decreased. The amino acid, or the photosynthesis efficiency of the plant decreased. The production of the sugars. The amino acid production here, that's the plant's ability to defend itself. The glyphosate caused it to decrease. And the water use efficiency, when you insert the glyphosate-tolerant gene in the plant and spray it with glyphosate herbicide, it takes more than twice as much water to raise the same amount of plant biomass. Now that research has only been done on one soybean variety that I'm aware of. It should be done on canola, corn, everything under the sun. But when we see the extreme drought conditions, we see this happening, which I'll show you a little later in the presentation. It takes more than twice as much water to raise around the same amount of plant biomass. What happens when the lignin content goes down? You lose your woody component in your plant. Corn don't stand up in Iowa when there's a 50-mile-an-hour wind and you don't have enough lignin in the plant. I talked about the increased diseases. This is scientifically documented. Diseases from A, apples, to W, wheat, and I think if they put zucchini in there, they'd have found it also. Dramatic increase of diseases as a result of the glyphosate, and you can trace it right back to killing the good organisms in the soil and promoting the growth of the opportunistic. This is a picture in Iowa in 2010. We had a pretty significant dry year that year. It wasn't as bad as 2012, but it was kind of interesting. What do you see of the color of the corn in the bulk of the fields in that picture? What color is it? What might you call brown corn if you see it? A lot of people say that. But this picture was taken the first week of August. We didn't have any frost yet. But we have seen a progression of the ill health of these corn crops despite the amount of fungicide that they might spray on it to try and keep it healthy. And isn't that a coincidence that glyphosate causes an increase of the fusarium fungi in the soil, and now all of a sudden we have to use more fungicide to raise a crop? But then in the middle of this whole thing, in this island, or the oasis in the middle of the desert, is a non-GMO cornfield. Second pass of Roundup sprayed on a soybean field in Illinois. The spray operator had a lot of ground to cover. He didn't have time to back in the corner of that field and hit that spot, so he just swung out and made sure he didn't hit that highline pole with the boom. Didn't put the second shot on. The sudden death syndrome, them beans didn't mature quicker. They have SDS, they died. Where they didn't get the second pass, they're greener. I mentioned glyphosate's registered and patented as an antibiotic. This patent was applied for in 2003, August 29, 2003, and it was granted on August 10, 2010. Glyphosate, according to this patent, it takes 1 part per million of glyphosate to kill the vast majority of the beneficial organisms that you would find in your digestive tract, that you want in your digestive tract. When you start reading this, it'll say, well, it's for parasite control. Well, that's an organism too. But in all of the research that has been conducted and published in the scientific literature that's properly conducted, you see glyphosate being very detrimental to beneficial organisms, and the opportunistic are more tolerant. The glyphosate residues, there was a study conducted by the U.S. Geological Survey in the U.S. in 2010 and 2011. They monitored the air, the rain, and the rivers in Iowa and Mississippi. They found significant levels of glyphosate in the air, in the rain, and in the rivers. The amount of glyphosate, according to this study, in the first inch of rain that would fall would be 0.48 grams. You think, well, that's not a big deal. Just hang on, I'll show you something about that it is a big deal. We have found glyphosate residues in alfalfa hay that is non-GMO alfalfa hay that was fertilized with poultry litter that contains significant levels of glyphosate because the grain that they fed the birds contained significant levels of glyphosate, and they passed it right through to the fertilizer that they put out the back end. Barley, corn, edible peas, beans, potatoes, soybean, the list goes on and on and on. The manure. Certified organic potatoes. Dr. McNeil had a customer that had significant problems with the potatoes in the certified organic farmer's field. They put 3 tons of poultry litter on those potatoes for fertilizer. When he had the problems, the plant health issues, they started doing the due diligence and tracking backwards, and they found there was enough glyphosate and AMPA in that poultry litter to equal 2/3 of a quart of glyphosate herbicide that was applied to that certified organic field. In 1994, the EPA said you could consume 2 parts per million per day per life and it wouldn't hurt you. In 1997, they raised the tolerance on the soy from 1/10 of a part per million to 20 parts per million, only a 20,000% increase. Routinely, 17 parts per million is found in soy. In one random sampling in Argentina, they found as high as 100 parts per million of glyphosate residue in the soil. Seralini has documented complete infertility when the presence of a half a part per million of glyphosate residue is present. It kills both the sperm and the egg. Why do we have so many miscarriages in our country? I don't know if you're experiencing it in your country, but in our country, the young women who are trying to start a family have come to accept the fact that 2 to 3 miscarriages is normal before they finally have a baby. I don't really believe it's normal. Endocrine disruption at 0.2 of a part per million. Endocrine disruption is simple. Endocrine disruptors are hormone mimickers that mess with the development of a developing fetus, first of all. So if you have an endocrine disruptor come in contact with the baby in the womb, it spells birth defects. If you have endocrine disruptors present in the environment and adults are exposed to them, it causes the formation of abnormal cells. What do you call it when you get a growth of abnormal cells in the body? A tumor or cancer? Dr. Andreas Carrasco was seeing a tremendous increase in the birth defects of the babies that were born to the women who lived immediately adjacent to the Roundup Ready soybean fields that were being sprayed with an airplane in Argentina. He documented it took 2.03 parts per million of glyphosate residue to cause significant birth defects to the frog and the chick embryos. Dr. Seralini did a lifetime feeding study. He basically repeated a study that was conducted by Monsanto to prove that their Roundup Ready corn was safe. He repeated and extended and added to it. They did a 90-day study. He did a 24-month or 2-year study. He used the same breed of rat they used. After his results of his study come out, he was accused by them of using the wrong breed of rat because that rat is prone to develop tumors. Well, everybody in the research arena knows that the Sprague Dawley rat is the ideal rat to use in any kind of that type of research, because guess what? The Sprague Dawley rat is just as prone to develop tumors in their lifetime as you and I are. So it's the ideal rat to use, but they stopped at a 3-month study and he did a 24-month study. At 4 months, he started to see tumor development, but they didn't see any because they stopped at 3 months. At 7 months, there was significant tumor development. And even in the non-GM fed rats, before they died, they developed tumors. But again, remember, they were prone to tumor development like we are. He also fed a little bit of glyphosate, way below the legal tolerant levels of glyphosate residue in the drinking water. And it caused both premature death and tumors. And he was criticized. And this study was published, and the fury of down below came upon him from the scientific community. And eventually the study was retracted by the journal that published it after a gentleman who coincidentally has done a lot of work for Monsanto was appointed as the head of that type of research and studies at this scientific journal. But then, lo and behold, the Seralini study was submitted to another journal, and it went through peer review 2 more times. So in essence, it was peer reviewed 3 times, and it was still published. But they still say it's no good because it came up with results that they didn't like. Now we go to Germany. Dr. Monika Kruger has documented it only takes 1/10 of a part per million of glyphosate residue in the rumen of the cow to kill 3 beneficial microorganisms. And when you kill them, they are the control for the Clostridium botulinum. When Clostridium botulinum goes unchecked, you have chronic botulism. And the cows die from toxic co-infection. A friend of mine from Denmark switched to non-GM feed for his sows, and he saw a dramatic improvement in his production, but he was still seeing some birth defects in the piglets that were born. And he saved every one of these pigs. And he was testing all of the feed he was feeding his animals. And he was documenting the amount of glyphosate residue in the barley and in the wheat and in the small grain that was being desiccated pre-harvest with glyphosate herbicide. And he was documenting the amount of glyphosate residue that was going into the diet of his sows. And he had all of these deformed pigs, and he kept accumulating and saving them and the birth defects that they were having. And there was a variety of birth defects. And this was published earlier this year, excuse me. They found glyphosate residue in the brain, in the lung, in the stomach, in the muscle tissue of these deformed pigs. And the sows were eating residue at 0.25 to 1.13 parts per million. Do you realize that they'll allow 40 parts per million in grain and 400 to 800 parts per million of glyphosate residue in different forages in our country, that being the U.S.? And they think that's safe. And the gentleman that raised these pigs was in China, and he made a profound statement to one of the women that was there to testify or speak on behalf of what she saw happen with her children when she put them on a non-GM organic diet and got the glyphosate residue out of their food supply and how healthy they became. He said, "At least I know how much glyphosate I'm feeding my sows. You have no idea how much you're feeding your children." Argentina. I talked earlier about the birth defects that Dr. Carrasco documented. The ruptured purpura is very, very common. The birth defects in 1997, 46 birth defects of 24,000 births. 2001, 60 of 21,000. In 2008, 186 birth defects of 21,000 babies. The rate of glyphosate application in that time, in 1996 they put on 1 liter per hectare. Today they're putting on 10 to 20 liters per hectare on the Roundup Ready soil in Argentina. In the U.S., is it happening? Are they looking for the answer? What's happening in the Yakima Valley in Washington State? The anencephaly, its epidemic rates. The only herbicide that's been allowed to be used for weed control in the Yakima Valley River Basin for the last 15 years is rodeo. It's a generic form of glyphosate herbicide. Anencephaly is when the baby is born without a brain. Most of them are not born alive. Some of them miraculously may live as much as a month. Dr. Nancy Swanson is a retired PhD physicist researcher from Washington State University. She did a career stint in our military and the Navy first, and then she was at Washington State. She decided to look and see if there was something going on. So she looked at the introduction of Roundup Ready crops in 1996 and the subsequent increased use of glyphosate herbicide in the U.S. up to 2010-2012 time period. I'm only going to show you some of the results that she had. This was just published in a scientific journal, by the way. The congenital birth defects from 2006 to 2010. Now, the thing that she did in this, and this is the whole, all of the different ailments and illnesses that she looked at the correlation factor. And I'll just use this autism as an example. The Pearson correlation coefficient, that's the similarity between this happening and this happening. That does not prove cause and effect. You could say in the same time period, cell phone use increased. But let's look at autism a little closer. Dr. Senaff has looked at it. that in 2007 in the U.S., 1 in 150 children had it. By 2009, it's 1 in 100. By 2013, it's 1 in 50. The way it's going, it's predicted to be 1 in 2 by 2020. How's that going to be sustainable? Diabetes. If we'd have stayed on the trend line that was started in 1960, we should be right here. But again, it went up. Correlation, 98%. This does not prove cause and effect in any way, shape, or form. But if it doesn't send a message for a wake-up call for the regulatory agencies to start investigating the epidemic increase of diseases that we're having in our country, what is it? The ostrich approach isn't working. They can't bury their head in the sand. A friend of mine in California sent me a picture of this. This was posted on the schoolyard where her children play. It has taken her quite a bit of time, but it sounds like they may not be posting that sign on the schoolyard anymore after her bulldog attitude and persistence. I don't think they're going to be spraying a glyphosate herbicide on that property anymore. And this is easy to use because all you got to do is go to the big box store and buy that jug that's ready to spray, and you come out here and you go, psst, there's a weed in the crack in the sidewalk in my driveway. You put, you give it a squirt and it's gone. Like, remember that if you have the commercials like we do in our country, it's so easy, it's so slick. Have you ever thought if you do spray a glyphosate herbicide on a weed and there's a crack in the sidewalk, when it rains, where's that residue of that chemical going to go? Now, my mother had a neat trick. She had this silver-looking thing that sat on the stove year-round. And every once in a while, she'd fill it up with water and set it on the burner and turn the burner on high. And after it'd sit there for long enough, it'd start to whistle, known as a teapot. She'd take that teapot off of there and that boiling hot water, and she'd go outside and she'd pour that on them weeds in the crack in the sidewalk. And then she'd go back, and she needed more water, she'd fill it up, set it on the stove again, go back outside, she'd pull them weeds out just like this. They had no resistance whatsoever. And as near as I could tell, there was no ill effect of that boiling water because by the time she got back there to pull the weed out, it had already cooled off. The amount of this stuff that's going on the crop ground is horrendous. But that's not the only way it's getting into our environment. What do you see in this picture? Pardon? Dust behind a combine that's harvesting corn. It happens to be triple stack Roundup Ready corn. We've noticed this for some time, and one gentleman, and this is a dust mask that I encourage every farmer to wear when you're working around any grain. Because the things that I'm going to show you don't stop at the fence line. I would like to think it could be that simple, but it doesn't. One gentleman noticed a lot of dust in when they were harvesting his brother's Liberty Link corn, which is similar to Roundup Ready. And he noticed more dust in his dad's Roundup Ready corn. So he took a sample of the dust from the Roundup Ready corn field off the combine after they harvested it, and he took the Liberty Link corn dust off the combine after they harvested it, and he had some dust in the hog confinement building. So he took them all, put them in a Ziploc bag, sent them to Midwest Labs in Omaha, and asked them to do a mold count and identification on this dust. When they sent him back the results, they said, anyone working in an environment that has more than 1,000 CFUs per gram of dust to this magnitude should be wearing a protective breathing device. Well, I apologize for how small this is. I'll read it off to you. The hog dust was 14,000 CFUs per gram. Remember, 1,000 CFUs per gram, you should have a dust mask on. Aspergillus niger, 1,000 Aspergillus species. Other, 10,000, and penicillium, 3,000. By the way, the Aspergillus species of mold and mycotoxin is the most detrimental. The mold count on the Liberty Link corn, 7,200,000. 7 million of that is Aspergillus and 200,000 is penicillium. The Roundup Ready corn dust was 15,600,000. It was all Aspergillus species. So what? Why is there so many people getting sick in our country about harvest time? Respiratory illnesses. Whether it's the people that live in the small rural communities adjacent to the fields that are being harvested, or it's the farmers that harvest them. This is an interactive slide. I need you to participate with me in this. Do you recognize any of the names in the center of the circle? Do you have commercials that advertise prescription drugs in your country? Have you ever seen a commercial for the purple pill that if you have digestive issues, you can take it? That commercial sponsored by AstraZeneca. Have you ever heard of something called atrazine? One of the oldest herbicides used in corn production. That's made by AstraZeneca Syngenta, who happens to be the 4th largest producer of genetically engineered seed in the world. When you see or hear Bayer, what's the first thing you think of? Have you ever heard of Bayer Crop Science, the makers of Aztec insecticide, Liberty herbicide, and Liberty Link corn, soybeans, cotton, and canola? When you see Pfizer Pharmacy up, John, what do you think of? RX. Did you know they were the sole parent company of Monsanto at one point in time? They're still connected. So we've established the fact that all of the companies in the center of the circle are in the pharmaceutical and chemical business. We're going to start with chemical. I want you to give me one word that you would use to describe a chemical that kills a weed or an insect. And you're describing that chemical to a 5-year-old child. What one word might you use?
Toxic.
Toxic. Okay, we're using something toxic to raise crops. What do we raise crops for? Cereal and grain. What do we feed the bulk of the grain to? Livestock. So in using this toxic material to raise this crop, if there were to be any residual effect, do you think it would be good or bad?
Bad.
So if there's an adverse effect of this toxin in the grain, and we feed the grain to the livestock, and the livestock don't feel good, who do we call for help? When the veterinary comes and looks at our livestock, what might he tell us to use to make them feel better? What if we want them to grow faster so we can be more cost efficient in our production and make more money raising this livestock? What might we give them? What do we raise livestock for?
Food.
Who eats the meat? If there's an adverse residual effect from this toxin that we use on the crop that might affect the grain, it could affect the livestock, is there a minor chance that it could affect the meat? If the people eat the meat and they don't feel good, where do they go? After you go to the doctor, where might he send you with a piece of paper with his autograph on it? Does this present a positive cash flow for the companies in the center of the circle? I'm getting towards the end, and I dump a lot of heavy information on people in this presentation, and I always like to end on a lighter note. Gilbert Hostetler is a gentleman in Illinois that raises seed corn, and he predominantly is non-GMO, but he had the cause and the reason to have GMO corn and non-GMO corn side by side in a sack in his warehouse. One day they went to get it, and this is what they found. The mice completely cleaned up the non-GMO corn and didn't touch the GMO corn. I showed this picture to a group of farmers in Ohio, and one of them decided to do his own experiment. He went and got an ear of corn out of the neighbor's field that was triple stacked, sprayed with glyphosate, and he put a nail in the tree And then he got one of his non-GMO and put that on the nail in the tree. And he took this picture 9 months later. This is a picture of Iowa from the airplane in 2012. This is a gravel road dividing this cornfield from this cornfield. This field has been under a glyphosate herbicide management program for 10 plus years. We had a severe drought in 2012, in Iowa, as you can see by the yellow and the brown in this cornfield. This corn the yield on that was appraised at 29 bushels per acre, and it was chopped for silage because it was not a high enough yield to harvest for grain. It was triple stack Roundup Ready corn. On this side of the gravel road, and you can see there were effects of the drought, especially right there. That was non-GMO corn raised in a biological crop production system, and it was harvested for grain, and that farmer settled with the federal crop insurance agent at 109 bushels per acre average yield. If you imagine that you jumped a fence on the other side of this field and there was another triple stack Roundup Ready cornfield that was appraised at 27 bushels per acre chopped for silage. You come across the fence this way and there was another Roundup Ready triple stack field of corn appraised at 12 bushels per acre and chopped for silage. So you have 12, 27, and 29. And 109. If you're interested in furthering your understanding of this whole subject, I have some suggested reading material for you. Seeds of Destruction by William Engdahl is a very well referenced book on what may be behind the objective of the whole genetically engineered seed concept. Don't read it before you go to bed at night. I read this book, the first 4 chapters of this book, on the way home from a meeting in Canada in Winnipeg in 2010. Dr. Huber and I were both at that meeting. He gave me this book because a friend of mine in the UK had given it to Dr. Huber. Dr. Huber read it on the plane ride home from Europe and then gave it to me at the meeting in Canada. And I read the first 4 chapters on the plane ride home, and I got home and I was in the office and I called Dr. Huber because I knew he would be driving from the airport back to his home in Idaho. And I said, if I'm interpreting this correctly, we're someday going to say that glyphosate makes DDT look like mouthwash. He says, I would not disagree with that. For what we know that's in the scientific literature and what we know that's pending publication, which we can't tell anybody about yet, I don't think there's ever been a more devastating chemical than glyphosate. And if anyone you know is thinking about having children, or if you yourself are of that age, I call this mandatory reading.
It's
by Theo Coburn. It talks about endocrine disruptors and the potential damage. Not only can it cause birth defects for the baby in the womb, these ill effects can affect the grandchildren of the baby in the womb. That's how devastating this is. We have to wake up. Another very interesting read, America's Two-Headed Pig. Dr. Art Dunham is a friend and a colleague, veterinarian in Northeast Iowa. His daughter wrote this book. And she looked at the 2 paths that production agriculture took in the United States. One was the economic path that was promoted and is the majority avenue, and the other was what could be done sustainably. Again, a very interesting read. Thank you for your attendance. Thank you for your attention. I will take any and all questions you have, and if I don't know the answer, I'll tell you I don't know the answer. Yes, ma'am.